안녕하십니까. 오늘 이른 아침 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 경제적으로나 정치적으로 국내외가 아주 어수선합니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 여러분들 건강하게 금년에 하시는 일들이 다 잘 되고 소원 성취가 되도록 기원을 합니다. 그리고 우리나라도 모든 것이 잘 풀려져서 금년에 좋은 한 해가 되었으면 하는 바람입니다. 그저 오늘이 19일이니까 이제 미국 날짜로 20일 모레 내일이죠. 미국 트럼프 대통령이 대통령 취임을 하게 됩니다. 미국은 특별한 나라지요. 세계 전체에서 보더라도 우리나라를 말할 것도 없고, 아직도 미국은 세계 경제 전체의 4분의 1을 차지하는 세계 제1의 경제 대국이고, 또 미국 달러는 사실상의 세계 키 커런시, 기축통화. 더욱더 중요한 것은 세계 제2차 대전 이후에 미국이 주도를 해서 만들어진 리버럴 이코노믹 오더가 지금까지 유지가 되고 또 그동안 지금까지 부지가 되어 왔습니다. 그런데 놀랍게도 전혀 국정 경험이 없는 도널드 트럼프가 대통령이 되어서 미국을 이끌게 되었기 때문에, 또 그동안 선거 과정에서 여러 가지 그분이 이야기한 것들이 글로벌 이코노믹 오더 지금까지 유지되던 것에 상당한 변화가 있을 수도 있고, 또 미국 자체 정책에도 여러 가지 변화가 있을 수 있을 것이기 때문에 세계가 아주 긴장을 하고 또 지금 주의 깊게 모두 보고 있습니다. 더더욱이 우리나라와 미국과는 동맹관계가 세계 어느 나라보다도 강한 것이 유지가 되어 왔고, 이 동맹을 기초로 해서 우리 경제가 또 그동안에 잘해왔기 때문에 우리는 더더욱이 다른 나라보다도 더 관심을 가지고 미국을 볼 수밖에 없습니다. 그런데 오늘 다행히 알렌 사이나이 박사가 오셔서 이 소위 트럼프노믹스와 또 미국 경제 전반적인 것, 세계 경제에 대해서 말씀을 해주시기로 되었습니다. 우리 알렌 사이나이 박사는 지난 거의 25년 동안 우리 연구원이 초창기에 만들어질 때부터 해마다 제일 먼저 우리 연구원에 와가지고 세계 경제 포캐스팅과 전망과 또 미국 경제 전망, 특히 세계 금융시장 전망에 대해서 말씀을 많이 해주셨습니다. 그래서 여러분들 아마 알렌 사이나에 대해서 잘 아시고 계시기 때문에 길게 인트로덕션 할 필요 없습니다만은, 제가 여러 번 이야기를 했습니다만은 알렌 사이나이 박사가 그동안에 미국에서 주로 금융시장 포캐스팅에서 그렇고, 이때까지 가장 애큐레이트한 포캐스터로서 그동안에 상당히 월스트리트저널이나 여러 언론에서 지적이 되어 왔습니다만, 최근에 와서는 더더욱이 알렌 사이나이 박사가 2007-2008년 그레이트 리세션을 사전에 워닝을 하고 in advance 워닝을 하고 거기에 대해서 일찌감치 포캐스팅을 하고, 또 그 리커버리가 보통 리세션의 V-shaped 빠른 리커버리가 아니고 상당히 protracted L-shape의 리커버리를 할 것이라는 것을 일찌감치 내다보고 했기 때문에 여기에 대해서 월스트리트에서나 미국 이 포캐스팅 커뮤니티에서 알렌 사이나이를 한 번 더 칭찬을 하고 하는 것을 최근에 그런 일이 있었습니다. 그리고 지금 오늘 아마 트럼프노믹스에 대해서 여러 가지 이야기를 해주실 텐데 이것도 여러분들 아마 귀담아 들으시면 많이 도움이 되리라고 생각합니다. 뭐 사이나이 박사는 길게 설명할 필요도 없습니다만 이분은 그야말로 이카노미스트, 오디너리 이카노미스트가 아닙니다. 절대 암추어 이카노미스트는 더더욱이 아니고 이분은 아카데믹스로 시작을 해가지고 원래 교수를 하다가 그 유명한 하버드 오토 엑스틴하고 DRI라는 그 포캐스팅 하는 기관을 만들어가지고 70년대, 80년대 초반까지 워튼에 있는 그 노벨상 받은 그 로렌스 클라인이 이끄는 웨파하고 DRI하고 근데 이 알렌 사이나이가 오토 엑스틴하고 둘이서 그 모델 빌딩을 해가지고 미국의 포캐스팅을 이끌어주고 있다. 그렇게 아카데믹에 있으면서 early 80s에 리만 브라더스에 가서 chief economist로 거기 또 오래 있었습니다. 오래 있다가 그 뒤에 와서는 decision economics라는 research 컨설팅 이런 모든 것을 하는 인스티튜션을 만들어서 지금은 뭐 정부 U.S. 페더럴 리저브도 가서 종종 어드바이스라고 화이트하우스나 바이파티선으로 많이 지금 일을 해오고 있습니다. 그래서 이분은 아카데믹스, 모델 빌더, 리서처 거기다가 또 he is an investor himself. He makes a lot of money too. And so 그리고 해마다 우리 연구원에 오고 또 가는 길에는 I think he's on his way to Japan. He will talk with Mr. Kuroda, and then this afternoon he will talk with the Bank of Korea governor as well. And he travels this part of the world, and he advises Japanese Treasury, Ministry of Finance, and the Central Bank as well. But anyway, we are very fortunate to have him every year, this year again, particularly with this Donald Trump's inauguration next 24 hours. And I think it's very, very fortunate to have him this morning. So with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Simon. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you so much. As always, our comradeship and alliance goes back 25 years. And I think we saw each other 40 years ago. And so I'm 107. Methuselah. So the only person in the United States who claims he has been around longer than I have doing economics and economic forecasting is Alan Greenspan. And he says 100 years. And I can't really claim to be around 100 years, at least not yet. I wanted to talk to you today about the U.S. and global prospect and the big change, the external shock, the U.S. election of 2016. External shock, in the work I do, is a technical term for something that happens, unforeseen, unexpected, that if permanent, will affect economic and financial systems and their interactions. It is a business cycle event. unless it comes and goes. The election of 2016 in the United States is without a doubt, in my view, analytically an external event, unforeseen, unexpected, and is going to bring and is bringing big changes, big changes in a number of dimensions with big effects. Other examples of external shocks in U.S. and world history include, in the 1970s, the oil price shocks. In 1973 to 75, the quadrupling of oil prices. Politically driven. In 1979, a doubling of oil prices. In subsequent years, we had oil price shocks that went the other way. Couple of years ago, oil prices fell from $110 a barrel to as low as under $30 a barrel. That was a shock. There are responses in these shocks to things that go on in the system, but when they happen, they're essentially outside the system, which is why we say external shock. The election of 2016 in the United States, I think, it was really long in coming. And when you see one of these external shocks, yes, it hits the system. It was not forecasted. Old forecasts go out the window because the shock, if permanent, will change things. And tremendous uncertainty surrounds the implications of that shock. But even the oil price quadrupling from very low $3 or $4 a barrel in 1973-74 was building in the world system of politics and economics for years. This election in the United States is, to me, what a very large part of America has been looking for a long time. Change. Change in Washington. Change in Washington. A part of the American system that so many Americans have thought was not functioning in the interest, in their interest, the interest of the people. We probably could just say that about the U.S. central government. There are central governments elsewhere in the world that might fit that description. But in America, the polls of what Americans think, how they think their future will be, the future of the United States, the place of the United States in the world, those polls have been extremely pessimistic for years. In 2008, and this is my opinion, but shared by many, we elected Barack Obama. And his inspiration in his rhetoric was of change. Change in Washington, societal change that would make America better for the American middle class and for Americans in general. Uplifting, inspirational. The speeches would bring tears to the eyes of people. In 2016, after 8 years of someone who went to Washington, who meant well, a good man, a good family, tried hard. Once again, the American electorate has elected someone to bring change. And the change is largely into the functioning of Washington as an entity in the U.S. system. I puzzled over the unhappiness shown in the polls of Americans in the surveys. Americans seem happy. You walk the streets, you go to the restaurants, they basically seem happy, but they're not. About the future, standing in the world. And in particular, the so-called American middle class is unhappy. The elites, the upper income echelons of our country, the so-called 1%, are happy. Things are fine. They have time to think about global warming. They have time to ruminate about inequality, even though those in the upper 1% are perpetuating the inequality by what they do, how much they earn, how they spend their money, the wealth that they accumulate, and even in education, the ability to send their kids to good schools because they can afford it. We have tremendous inequality in the United States of income, relative inequality of income, wealth, and education. But a big part of the United States is not sharing in the kinds of things that the so-called elite, the entrenched, the rich are sharing in. And they have been unhappy. They are unhappy. And Mr. Trump was elected because of them. Now, my friends, colleagues, I live in the northeast part of the United States, in the Boston area that you know so well. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. My father had no education. He was an immigrant from Russia, Poland. He worked as a laborer, earned enough money so I could go to college. We were on the poor side. I just happened to be a bright kid. I went to the University of Michigan. My college education cost my parents, for 4 years, $10,000. And that was high because I lived in a fraternity and that cost money. My father worked very hard to provide that opportunity for me. And I got lucky. I was bright. I was energetic. I was ambitious. I went on to get a PhD in economics, somehow managed to almost accidentally end up at Data Resources with Otto Eckstein. And all kinds of things have happened to me, to my family, kids, grandchildren. It's the American dream. The American dream and the expectation of it for a lot of Americans is not happening now. And that is why, in my opinion, Mr. Trump, against all odds, in a bizarre political year, ended up winning. Those in the elite, the establishment, the bureaucracy, the Washington inner circle, the media, my good friends in the Boston area, Harvard law professors, prominent economists, Nobel Prize winners, myself, they didn't get it. Now, I think I got it because I grew up in Detroit. And I have the instincts of a poor person from a family that managed to provide to me an opportunity to take part in what is wonderful about America, to come from nowhere, bright, hardworking, and to achieve and to see your family, your kids, your grandchildren do better, have wonderful educational opportunities than I did. I have lived the American dream, so many of us in the United States, but that is not the case now. And let me just give you an example of what I have learned and think that tells why Mr. Trump got elected. It's important to understand why it happened, then to look at the man, what we have learned so far, and then I will take you through part of the agenda of an incoming Trump administration, the macro policy part of what we can call Trumponomics. By the way, that's very positive for Korea, that part of it. But we'll get to that. Why? Because the puzzle for me is, I read the data, the U.S. economy, about a year, 2 years ago, I began to talk about the economy lifting up out of the rut of the L-shaped non-recovery. The V never happened. We did forecast that it would not happen. A lot of technical reasons for that. But then I began to forecast a much better situation, and even that has been slow in coming. In GDP growth terms, a better situation, something like 2.5%, maybe 2.75% real GDP growth in 2017. This is before Trumponomics, against 2% a year for the last 5 or 6 years. That's a definite pickup. And the data on the consumer have looked very good. Areas of the U.S. economy are growing very dynamically. The unemployment rate has come down to 4.9% from 10% at its worst. Since the worst times, 15 million jobs have been created. A lot of them are part-time jobs. They get counted in the data. But still, the data, the numbers have looked good. And the mood of America, in terms of how they feel in the future, has, in the polls, been awful. So here's what happened to me and woke me up as a technical economist and made me, one of the things that made me realize I was thinking in the wrong way. I was on a radio program, and people call in on the radio program. You must have them here in Seoul, call-ins. And, of course, those who call in are usually unhappy types of people. They're a little bit off the mainstream of thinking. But I love that because you hear what quote-unquote ordinary people are thinking. And I was talking about how the U.S. economy was improving, getting better. I was very optimistic on the prospect. The caller called up and said I was totally wrong. Now, that was the first time on that program on call-ins that anybody challenged me and disagreed and said I was all wet. Because most of the time, my look at things was in the thinking of ordinary people. I can talk to them in the language, non-technical language. I love that. I talk to everybody, taxi drivers, everybody, waitresses, salespeople, ask them how things are going, what they think. In the summer, in a very upscale part of the world, Martha's Vineyard, I pretended I was a Trump supporter, and I learned that someone who ran a shop, once he knew I was a Trump supporter and wouldn't rat on him because he was a Trump supporter, he told me what he really thought. He was a Trump supporter. I really learned something. I'm not going to tell you how I voted. My politics are independent, but this is how I gather information, and I love doing that. Well, the caller calls up and says, things are terrible. You're wrong. I haven't had an increase in wages in 5 years. And I said, well, yeah. Now, for those of you who are technical, W, that's the numerator. P is price, the denominator. Real wages are what we economists think is conceptually the way to think about wages. And in the U.S., we had no inflation. So he really was just as well off as he was before, but he didn't feel it because he had not seen an increase in W in the nominal wage rate. And I thought to myself, Ilse Kahn, this is money illusion. The real world is a world of money illusion, not what we economists think it should be, which is real wages. It's money illusion. And that's why he felt badly. It's like a bright light hit me in the head. On Martha's Vineyard this summer, where President Obama was residing, playing golf at the club where I play golf. It is an upscale place, Martha's Vineyard, definitely. Costs a lot of money to own homes there. A lot of people owned homes when it was cheaper. And I went to the golf club where he was playing and was stopped, of course, by Secret Service people who checked everybody. There were 3 of them. There was a big, tall man with a black dog, I assumed a bomb-sniffing dog. The president was on the golf course. The other 2 looked under the hood and the trunk of my car, waved the wand, checked me out, and the man with the black dog, big, tall man, walks over to me, and the dog sniffs around and says to me, "Are you playing golf today?" I was in tennis clothes. I said, "No, I'm not playing golf. I'm hitting with a tennis pro." Aha, hitting with a tennis pro. That costs more money than just playing tennis. And I'm coming into this club. And I talked to him. I said, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm checking out people who come in." And I said, "What do you do? Do you live on the island and work on the island?" He walks over to me, stoops down, because a tall guy is sitting at the driver's seat, looks me in the eye and he says, "I can't afford to live on this island." And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Only the rich and famous can afford to live here." And I looked at him and I said, "You know, you're right. That's terrible. People can't afford to live here unless they're rich." I don't know about famous. I don't regard myself that way. I don't regard myself as rich. But he had a point. And then he said, "You know, I put 3 kids through college. I've worked hard all my life. College cost $100,000 for each of those kids. One of them has a job. It's a terrible job. And the other 2, these are all boys, do not have a job." What did I learn from that conversation? Well, from these 2 anecdotal stories, I learned that we economists, when we think W over P, real wages, are wrong. Ordinary people, if they don't see an increase in their wage, the dollars per hour that they earn, feel lousy. And what did I learn from a man who tells me only the rich and famous can afford to live here? That's inequality. He resents it. And what did I learn about his family, and the American dream? He's disappointed it hasn't happened. He's got a couple of kids who are still living off his work. They can't find a good job. Eye-opening. That's an ordinary American, that guy who came up to me with a dog. If you look and talk, I ran into that everywhere. In the last 3 to 6 months, I was looking. And because I grew up in Detroit, it resonated. Because Detroit, as the time when I grew up, the auto center of the world. And you in South Korea understand the auto industry and the ups and downs and how important that is and has been to South Korea. The ups and downs, the cyclical, and the depression and unhappiness when the auto industry was doing poorly, I felt it. Now, somehow, Mr. Trump picked that up. He picked up the unhappiness about Washington, that the kind of people I mentioned don't think Washington listens to them, and Washington doesn't, because they were still not doing well. Where did Mrs. Clinton campaign in most of the summer? The night or 2 before the election, she was on stage with Sonny Bono, with all the rich, famous people singing. Where was Donald Trump? Flying around in that plane to 16 different states like Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, talking to ordinary people. How in the world did he pick it up? But he did. So he touched the resentment about Washington. He touched all the people who haven't had an increase in wages. He touched, with what he said, all the scared Americans because of terrorism. All the Americans who look at the U.S. and its place in the world and think we're declining. And he touched all those people who are not part of the establishment and the elite and observe the inequality in egregious ways that shows up all over America. It's amazing. And so, but he picked it up, and despite his personal style, which is not my personal style, nor is his personal style anything I'm going to tell our grandson to emulate. He is not a role model in his personal style, and I doubt that the international community will find him to be so. That's, I think, how he got elected. Now, what's the problem with the American middle class? It's the following. How much does it cost to go to college in the United States now? For me, it was $10,000 for 4 years. Look at the return on that investment. I wish my parents were alive to see that. And I could give them some financing so they could live better than they lived because of the return on the investment. The $100,000 for that gentleman who talked to me on the golf course premises, that number is now $200,000 for a good 4-year school. $200,000 for a family that earns $200,000, $300,000 a year, both working, is a lot of money that has to be put away. 2 kids, you're getting to $500,000 put away. Big money. How much does the first house cost a young family now? Well, our first home cost $45,000. The home on Martha's Vineyard, we paid $150,000 for. We built it. It's worth $1.5 million now. Somebody now buys a new home on Martha's Vineyard, you can't get in there for less than $1 million unless you live shabbily. So the entry cost for a first house for an American family is huge. What about the 2 working families? They have to deal with daycare. They have to deal with nannies. $25,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. Students go to college, they have to borrow money to finance it. And then they go out, they can't get a job, they're saddled with debt. And they need, even though it's a low interest, to pay that. What about retirement? We do our own retirement in the United States now. Companies don't do it. Why don't companies do it? They don't want to bear the expenses. They want to maximize shareholder value is what they want to do. And so retirement expenses are done by us, employees, in the form of 401ks. I don't know how you do it in South Korea, but that's the case in the United States. And healthcare. Healthcare costs, insurance premiums, under Obamacare, before, during, after, have been huge. Wow. Squeeze. The middle class is squeezed. They're going to be unhappy until it gets better. And that, I think, for some reason, is how Donald Trump tapped into the disconnect. So, he is the president. It is an unusual historical circumstance. The election is like no other in U.S. economic history, and it is an external, unforeseen event that has hit the economic and financial system of the United States and the world because of the importance of the United States, the number 1 largest economy in the world, tied in through the rest of the world internationally, diplomatically, all kinds of alliances, all kinds of negotiated alliances, all of which now, on the words of the president, tomorrow the president, up for grabs. So what can I help you with at this point? One, I can talk about some of the big changes and big effects in the context of this external event. But the first thing I would say is you've got to wipe the slate of what you think about the future pretty much clean, because this is so big, it's epochal. It is so big in politics and institutions and the practice and the processes of Washington, in my view. It will have major effects on the U.S. economy. Things will happen and be done that we've never seen before. Relationships with the world and other countries will be different. And the personal style of the president will continue much as we have seen it. So all bets are off. You've got to go to square one. Think about everything in a zero-based way. It's not quite that bad. I think I can give you some guidance as to what you should look for. So what we see first are the appointments of President-elect and to be President Trump. An interesting set of appointments. By and large, except for the military people that have been appointed, the heads of Chief of Staff and the National Security Agency, and a couple of people in charge of agencies that are Congress people that have been in Washington. The bulk of the crew of appointees has never worked in Washington. These are business people and financial people. They are not bureaucrats. They are not the lifer politicians. They are not part of the political system. Virtually every one of the major appointments is either someone who has been critical of Washington, how it operates, or has managed to win and do well despite Washington. That's the case of the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin, who made a lot of money during the financial crisis by buying a bank that was in trouble over mortgages, even as Goldman Sachs, as part of Wall Street, kind of took America for a ride. That's very interesting. Now, for years, I've looked at Washington, and I finally figured out why we don't understand Washington. It's because the objective of Washington is not to maximize profits or shareholder value. The objective of Washington is not to do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, which is what most American workers are all about. Put in their time, get paid, go out and have a good time with the family. It's not, in the case of a lot of financial institutions, honest financing of enterprise in the system. The objective in Washington, from the minute the politicians get there, especially in recent years, has been to start running for re-election, raise money to run for re-election, and then go out and do it, and to prevent the other party from winning. That's not why I sent my representatives to Washington. I sent them to solve problems, world problems, to set up trade alliances, to make us safe from terrorism. That's what it has come to. Their objective is different, so their behavior is different. So in a somewhat jesting way, over many years, I have said, wow, if I had it to do, I would simply start all over again and fire them all. That sounds like Donald Trump, doesn't it? Well, that's the way I have felt. He's gone in, and he is not bringing anybody in that is an entrenched Washington person. That's good and it's bad. It'll be a fresh look. Washington will not be the same. So, big change number one. It's permanent. If he's there for 4 years, I know a lot of my Democratic friends would like to see him impeached. I don't think that will happen. He's there for 4 years. No one thinks he'll be reelected. I don't know. We'll see. If people in America, their wages are going up, they're working, we have an unemployment rate down to under 4%. Inflation may be high, but I don't think politicians worry about that if people are happy. And we're secure from terrorism. And there's a sense that America is on the way up in the world. I think that's about all a lot of Americans want to see happen. It's interesting. I think this is a guy who understands that. So, Washington will not be the same. You have to expect the unexpected out of Washington. You got to expect unpredictability out of the executive branch. You have to expect policy changes of huge, momentous importance. In the United States, we expect certainly an appointment to the Supreme Court be very conservative. As for the U.S. Federal Reserve, the central bank as we know it, a year and a half from now, will be very different. President Trump has 2 appointments to the board in Washington this year. They won't be any of my good friends like Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Stanley Fischer. They won't be the academics. There'll be business types. There'll be banking types. Probably be people whose names are unfamiliar. Then the chair of the Federal Reserve. These are predictions, by the way. I have no inside information. It's the style of the business person who now is in charge of Washington. Washington is being taken over by business people and financial people, not by Obama-like people, not by thinkers, not by societally concerned people. These are business people. They don't think like academics. They don't think like people who debate and then don't do anything. They want to see things happen yesterday. It's a huge change in the culture is going on. I will be amazed if we have the same number of people working in the Department of Energy that we have now. In the department that houses the data operations, I will be amazed if academic economists have anything to do in Washington anymore for quite a while. I'm telling my friends in the Boston area, forget it. You're not going to be trotting down there and your opinions won't be asked anymore. It's going to be people from the Midwest, places that you don't think should exist. It's a tremendous difference in the whole culture of what is going to happen. And it is a shock. It is a shock. And those countries and people who deal with Washington are in for a shock. It just isn't going to be the same. Now, I can't tell you exactly in the details of programs because they haven't been formed yet, but I am absolutely sure of this. The committees that have been formed, advisory committees by President Trump, are made up of very prominent financial and business people. Very good people like Jamie Dimon. Very good people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. A hedge fund giant, Steve Schwartzman, and he is a fan of carried interest, which is a loophole that the hedge fund people should get. Silicon Valley group of people, the technology people, headed by a maverick, that group, Peter Thiel. He surrounded himself with people who don't necessarily think the way he does. In testimony in his hearings, Mr. Sessions said waterboarding is illegal. Mr. Trump has not said that. He said we should let Muslims in. This is the Attorney General in his hearings. He's under oath. In a news conference, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, 79 or 80, a billionaire, you don't go to Washington to make another billion if you're 80 years old. There isn't time. You go to Washington to really make a difference. He's Secretary of Commerce. I think he's a good guy. But what did he do? He tore companies apart, fired people, put them together, made a lot of money. And then you have the Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin. And in a press conference, they said, the rich aren't going to get all those dollars from tax cuts because we're going to take away their exemptions and their deductions, and they take them. So they're not going to get a big tax cut. They're going to get a big cut in tax rates, and that will provide incentive effects. Mr. Trump has not said that. So it'll be interesting to see what goes on, but there's no doubt it's a different crew of people, different attitude. And when they go to Washington as time goes by, Washington will not be the same for at least 4 years and probably for decades. This is a huge change. And of course, Congress has a big effect on our institutions and legislation. And so we're going to get on economics a pro-growth approach. And here I can talk more specifically about the plan, the Trumponomics plan, and relate what is likely to happen to the economy as we integrate it into our forecasts of the next 1 to 3 years, as well as take account of the risks of what goes on. So let me define Trumponomics for you as its macroeconomic policy, its policies on trade, It's policies on immigration. It's bigger than economics. It's policy on health care, education. The outlines of what we have seen so far indicate very little, essentially no attention to the societal issues that occupied the Obama administration. Global warming, education skill set conversion, inequality. Nothing going on that's going to deal with the problem of inequality. Societal issues of significance to a lot of Americans. Let me deal with the macroeconomic policies because that's the easiest at this point to deal with and the clearest, the Trumponomics part. Immigration, by the way, is also part of the whole rubric and umbrella of what I might call Trumponomics, but imitation is more than economics. It has economic effects, but it also deals with something that is very historically unique to the United States, which is very open borders and immigrants in our country. And I'm a son of one of those who have lived and worked and become dedicated Americans in a system that has allowed us educational opportunity and other opportunities that I have found do not exist, have not existed anywhere else in the world. It's kind of the American miracle. On the policy, the Trump economic plan is a very big fiscal stimulus plan. It is not far off a document and plan of the House Republican leadership spearheaded by Paul Ryan called A Better America. They're very close. The House Republicans don't want to spend as much money as the Trump economic plan will spend. But in the United States now, there is a constituency among Republicans and Democrats that we need to do something about infrastructure. And in the Trump plan, there is a sizable amount of funds allocated to infrastructure. And there is, on the federal government spending side, a sizable amount of funds allocated in the plan to beefing up the military. That will be easy to do because the country, America, is scared of terrorism, of everything that's going on around the world. And that, by the way, means that the Trump administration will be a friend of South Korea. Because North Korea not only threatens your security, but a renegade country like North Korea with nuclear weaponry threatening to build a missile that can reach the west coast of the United States is something that President Trump will have to pay attention to because I believe he wants to deliver security and safety to the psychology of the American people. He says it in all his speeches, terrorism, we're going to wipe it out immediately. This is part of it. It means the U.S. will be a strong ally in international affairs of South Korea on the international side. Now, this economic plan on paper of Trump is $587 billion a year over 10 years. That's $1.6 trillion. That's $5.6 trillion. That's a lot. We have downsized it a little bit to make it analytically manageable to $500 billion a year. $100 billion is federal government purchases, $50 billion infrastructure, $50 billion military. If this is approved in the budget process of the United States Congress, and I don't think there's much doubt in my mind that it will be, then we're going to see $100 billion a year, roughly, of deficit-financed government spending stimulus in the United States economy. And that's going to go on for more than a year or two or three. That will raise real economic growth. About 0.5% a year all by itself. We have had flat to negative in real terms spending out of the federal government purchases side for the last 5 years. The U.S. economy has grown only 2% a year. Makes a difference. On the tax cut side, about $400 billion a year of tax reduction, principally tax rate reduction. The corporate statutory tax rate on the Trump plan would go to 15% from 35%. And on Paul Ryan's A Better America plan would go to 20%. Tax rates down. The biggest tax cut for corporations in the history of the United States. There are other changes in the tax code as they relate to American business. There is a constituency to eliminate the carried interest. All the capital expenditures would be fully expensed. Interest deductibility would no longer be allowed. That would help level out the cost of capital. I'm not sure all these things would happen. And a border tax is talked about, a 35% tax on imports, all imports that come to the United States, to raise money to fund the corporate profits tax rate reduction. That one probably won't happen. That tax proposal I am finding in Asia is the most worrisome issue. Certainly, I found that in Japan. I'm finding that here. Why? Because for all countries that export to the United States, the U.S. is the biggest customer of so many countries. A 35% tax of what is sent to the United States is really going to damage, from the point of view of the U.S. buying these goods or producing and shipping back to the States, it's really going to damage that. The idea of that is for the United States to buy less from overseas and to make American companies produce the goods that are produced overseas for purchase and sale in the United States, is to make more stuff in America and to buy more stuff in America to make America great again. It could happen. One day the president says one thing, another day the president says another thing. The last thing he said was, and I can believe it, for Donald Trump, it's too complicated. I'm sure it's too complicated for Mr. Trump. He is reported not to be a deep reader, to get his news from TV and friends or the internet, and not to be well informed on lots of things. So I think an ideal partner for him will be Paul Ryan, because Paul Ryan knows the budget, taxes, everything about finance better than any economist I know. He's Speaker of the House. So Mr. Trump and Paul Ryan as a partnership, to me, make passing big tax cuts for individuals and corporations a slam dunk. You know what I mean by slam dunk? Yeah, you've got some tall South Korean basketball players here. Slam dunk. Done deal. Now, the tax cuts for individuals involve simplifying the tax code. That's tax reform, 3 rates instead of 7. The top rate goes from 39 to 33% and down to, I would call them middle-class families of $200,000 or so. It does involve, at least from Mr. Ryan, an elimination or phasing out of a lot of tax expenditures, the itemized deductions that mainly rich people take. And so the actual number of absolute dollars, while on the tax rates are very high for the high-income families, still more but less for lower-income families, the net for the higher-income families will not be as big as those tax rate cuts, But the incentive effects, that's the theory of this, will remain because of lower tax rates. More incentives to work, more incentives to produce, more incentives to save. And we need to remember that the tax reform part of it is going to make the unequal distribution of the proceeds of the tax cuts not as unequal, still be unequal, but not as unequal. Now, I think the middle-class families whose tax rates get reduced and get some money, our work says they're going to spend most all of it. Those are families of 200, 300,000. They'll save some for college, but they're pressed, even earning that kind of money. They're pressed because look at what they have to save to put away for the future that they didn't have to do before. That's the squeeze on the middle class. The more wealthy people will invest the money. They won't spend much of it. And where does it go? It goes into financial institutions through financial intermediaries, and it might fund some student that comes from South Korea to study in the United States, developing an app who could strike it rich if it's a big app that works on Apple. We have a kid in our community who will be worth $1 billion, one of the strangest kids we've ever seen. I'm an investor in this company, and it is one of these loyalty things. It's called Level Up, and the company's going gangbusters. And when my private equity person said, here's what I want you to put some of your extra saving into, a company Level Up, and I said, well, who runs it? And I learned it was this kid. I said, I'm not investing in that company. This kid is strange. By the way, I'm not talking about your kids. I'm talking about a kid in Lexington, Massachusetts. You know what I invested? It's gangbusters. The high-income families put their money away. A bunch of it flows through places like, the financial intermediaries, investment banks, who are promising and trying to get big returns, and there are big risks. But in a good economy, the returns will probably be there. And the money doesn't come from banks in the United States anymore for a lot of these startups. It comes from the financial intermediaries, the private equity firms, venture capital, basically coming from the saving of high-income families. And so it makes its way into the economy. It just isn't spent right away. 3, 4, 5 years, if the money works, you'll have a new company with a lot of jobs, a Google, a Facebook. A lot of the funding came from rich people who saved that money. Economists don't really appreciate this. It's called trickle down. It just doesn't give the same spending impact. But the bulk of the funds of those tax cuts for individuals are going to raise consumption because a large injection of disposable income will come into the economy. Most of it will be spent. And so the tax cut part of Trumponomics, big money now, $500 billion a year, deficit financed. The economy will grow faster. Inflation will rise faster than it would have. The Federal Reserve will have to think more about raising interest rates sooner and more than they would have otherwise. Of course, by the time they get around to this, it'll be a different Federal Reserve, and they may not raise interest rates as much as they should or as much as the market wants. The unemployment rate will be lower. There'll be more people working. And because growth is higher, revenues from sales, and because inflation is higher, revenues because of higher prices for businesses will grow faster. That's earnings. And even though interest rates are rising, the stock market will price those earnings, and the stock market will go up, I believe, and the U.S. stock market and stock markets around the world will make repeated new highs, including the South Korean stock market. Not every day, not every month, not every quarter. It's not straight up. This program, remember, this is new. It's a shock. It wasn't on the horizon before. I am assuming it gets passed fairly fast. Republican Congress, alliance between Trump and Paul Ryan. At the end of the day, one of the best salespersons in the world, Donald Trump. He won the election. He's a salesperson. Let's face it. If indeed, he's not everybody. Well, I'm not going to say this because we do have press in the room. He's a salesperson. He does whatever he has to do to make the sale. That's what salespeople do. And if you run a business and you want to do well, you want a good salesperson. They don't always do things the way the ethics book says they're supposed to do it in the name of making money. A better stock market will bring in some capital gains tax receipts. So it's not as expensive ex post as it is ex ante, this $500 billion a year program. Because what happens when the economy grows faster, the economy's growth generates some additional tax receipts as time goes by. There's some more income tax receipts because more people earn money and are working. There's some more Social Security tax receipts because more people are working and paying Social Security. There's some more tax receipts out of the corporate sector. Net, their tax bill goes down. But in a better economy, they end up paying taxes on the better earnings and the better sales. And there is, and this is a big sleeper, depends on the stock market, capital gains tax receipts. And if you look at the history of what's happened when we've had these kinds of tax cuts, the thing that is most surprising is the increase in capital gains tax receipts because of a better stock market. And there's a little bit of excise tax receipts increase, and then the transfer payments to the public for more people working and a lower unemployment rate go down. In addition, there's going to be a 10% tax, supposedly on those, a forgiveness tax on those companies who repatriate funds in the United States, which we estimate can raise about $250 billion. So the net cost is not as big as it looks of the Trump program, but it is deficit finance. There'll be more Treasury issues, and without a doubt, interest rates will go up. So, big growth stimulator. It's going to raise inflation. The growth and rise in inflation will cause interest rates to go up. The Federal Reserve will have to raise interest rates probably more than they would have otherwise. We will have bigger deficits. Nominal GDP will grow faster, so the deficit to GDP ratio likely goes up, but not all that fast. We're now 3% of GDP, so we have room to grow. And here's how we've changed our forecasts. Growth in 2017, without this external shock, the Trump victory, Trumponomics, this part of it that I've described, we had 2.6% as our estimate, and growth in 2016 was somewhere around 2.1%. That's an improvement. The U.S. economy was already improving before this election and before this plan. Second, next year, we're forecasting it's robust, 3.5% growth. Before Trumponomics, 2.9, 0.6 of a percentage point increase. The 2.9 next year is far above already the consensus for next year and the Federal Reserve's forecast, which for next year, 2018, is on the order of 2+%. Obviously, I think those forecasters and those forecasts are going to have to come up, particularly under a Trumponomics plan, assuming it's passed relatively soon. 2019, 3 to 4% growth, a boomy U.S. economy, a boomy U.S. economy. Expansion still going on in 2019. The unemployment rate we are estimating Before we thought it would get down to 4.3, 4.4. I think it now will end up under 4. Inflation, which has started to move up, we're approaching, on the CPI, we're 2% year over year. On the consumption deflator, we're 1.5% year over year. By the end of this year, next year, we're probably 2.5% on inflation. Yes, that will violate the 2% limit of our central bank. But we're going to have 6 new people on the central bank by a year and a half from now. 2 appointments this year to the board in Washington. Mr. Lacker is leaving. That's Richmond. Mr. Lockhart is leaving. That's Atlanta. Those appointments are made by regional boards of the regional banks, but Washington will have an effect on that. Ms. Yellen, Chairperson Yellen, his term is up the end of next January. My guess is she will not be reappointed, and she will probably, though she has time in her term, move on to something else. And our good friend, Stanley Fischer, one of the best central bankers and human beings in the world, in my opinion, a wonderful man. He could be the head of any central bank. I think he'll leave. He will not feel comfortable, in my opinion, with the crew of central bankers that will come in, because the ones who come in will not be academics. They won't be like Ben Bernanke. They won't be like Janet Yellen. They won't be like me. I'm basically an academic. And they probably will not be from the institute. There won't be Nobel Prize winners. Gone. Gone. These are business people. Economists bore them. They fight all the time about details. Business people have no patience for that. And we're too slow. Obama was fine with that. He was an intellectual guy. Even he ran out of patience, according to the books, with some of the discussions between Larry Summers and Christina Romer. Too much of fighting going on. That's what we economists do. It's in our DNA. And we talk too long. I'm going to hurry up here and finish. It'll be, in my opinion, very different crew of people. Very different crew. So will be the Council of Economic Advisors. The head of the National Economic Council is a Goldman guy. The Goldman people are very good at getting people together. He's quite good, Mr. Cohn. He'll do well at the National Economic Council. As for who makes the final decisions and what they are, I'm going to close with a final big change notion. There are 8 or 10 of those that I was going to go over. It's the unpredictability and the uncertainty. That's a big change with big effects. It applies to everything. I don't think this is someone, the president, who is going to delegate the final call. And I don't think he's going to want people to know what's in his mind and head, because in part I don't think he knows on a lot of issues. And so what you get when you look at Washington, you're in the markets, you're in business, what you're going to get is unpredictability and uncertainty, because so far that's the personality of the man in charge. The people around him that he's appointed are not like that. The president is a different kind of president than anybody I've ever seen, with the exception maybe of Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics, which so totally changed the course of America in so many ways. This president and the way it's happened is the most unusual political event and happening on the national political scene that I've ever seen, and in my reading of U.S. history that I've ever seen in history. A couple words on trade and protectionism. In my opinion, the targets are China and Mexico more than anything. And so China, politically, the United States, we've been unhappy in the United States with China and their trade practices for a long time, and that's telegraphed already by President Trump. It's the competition that comes from China from a weak currency and all of that, from the production of cheap goods all over the place. And I think China is the main target in this part of the world of trade issues and toughness on trade. I do not think South Korea is. I do not think Japan is. A border tax, of course, is a red flag to everybody, every country that's in the export business. My hope is they don't do that. That invites retaliation, trade wars, protectionism. No economist thinks anything good can come out of that. The other target is Mexico, and that's because so many American companies have located in Mexico because of NAFTA and for other reasons to cheaply produce goods that are sold back to the United States. So a lot of jobs go down to Mexico. And for someone who has promised, make America great again, we're going to produce it here. We're going to help the American worker. It's an obvious target, Mexico. Now, whether they build a wall, the Great Wall of Mexico, or is it the Great Wall? It'll be called the Donald Trump Wall of Donald Trump. It'll have his name on that wall if they build it. That's a pretty long border to build a wall on. Not as long as the Great Wall of China, but pretty long. And an electronic fence, I doubt it. I doubt it. On immigration, very big societal issue in the United States, and we'll see how that goes. A lot of mixed opinions. But I think for you, the trade and protectionism is the biggest issue. On our work at this point, the macro stimulus of the macro policy of lower taxes, more federal government spending, lifts the U.S. economy enough so that what we buy from the demand side from a country like South Korea will outweigh whatever measures might occur that might hurt the exports of South Korea. The macro wave, and that's why I emphasize it, is very big, because that shock to the U.S. and the U.S. economy's response to it is an external shock to the world. No one forecasting in the future of the South Korean economy was thinking of anything like what's going on now and the potential effects of that macroeconomic stimulus on the U.S. and then on South Korea. No one. And we have to figure that out. But it's going to help. It's going to help the overall economy of China. It's going to help the overall economy of Canada. It's going to help the economy of Germany. And then those economies will do better. They're already doing better. They're already doing better. The world economy is picking up. This is coming on top of it. And that makes me think, when I look at South Korea and the South Korean economy as a forecaster, that the economy on a GDP basis will be stronger in 2017 and 18 than it was in 2016. You're in the 2.5% range, and you'll be getting up to 3% by 2018. And inflation, which is very low, will be up. And interest rates, which are being held down, will be up. As for the currency, the implication of the Trump plan, without a doubt, is positive for the U.S. dollar. Stronger growth, higher rates, deficit finance stimulus. What hurts the dollar is going to be uncertainty about the stability of the United States, and it will be back on the president. Do you put your money in a place where you have an unpredictable head of state and don't know what he's going to do or say, and how his relationships and our relationships with the rest of the world are going to play out? Are we going to end up with a clash? Are we going to end up a war somewhere? Are we going to end up having a huge clash with China? What's going to happen to these overtures to Russia? Will the United States end up inflating its way out of the debt that we're going to create with this plan 4 or 5 years from now? Will the appointments to the Federal Reserve give us a central bank that isn't independent, that will let inflation go up to 3, 4, 5%, like what happens in Latin America? in the name of winning elections. I think that's farther down the road, but that is a scenario that I have seen happen in a lot of parts of the world, and you have seen it in Asia, not in South Korea, but you've seen it in Asia. People in power want to stay in power. They spend. They give people lower taxes. They think they're doing the right thing. People feel good. And then suddenly, one day they wake up. They have runaway inflation. They let it happen to take down the real value of the debt that has been created to create a superficially strong situation. And then the currency collapses. Well, they stop that by fixing the currency so it won't collapse, but you can't stop it. Someday the currency collapses. And you have things go on that have gone on in Venezuela, have gone on in Chile, and many, many years ago in Latin America. Dismal prospect, it's a longer run, but I have to say it's on our radar screen. But for the next 1 to 3 years, at this point, because of that macro stimulus, the external shock, and the way things so far are unfolding, it's positive. The economy, it means higher inflation. It will help the South Korean economy. And I doubt that America will try to punish South Korea all by itself on anything having to do with trade. And my guess is the administration will stand with South Korea in any conflict situation with North Korea. I can't picture any other choice or any other view coming out of the people who are going to come into Washington. Thank you. We should take some.
Trumponomics will be positive. Nobody knows really the impact in the long term. And yesterday, the day before yesterday, Lady Summers contributed a column in the Financial Times. As always, as expected, it was quite pessimistic about the medium to longer term perspective. But even him, in the short term, the macroeconomic, the pickup will be realized. But anyway, I think Alan really provided very, very interesting and penetrating analytic rigor and very, very interesting stories. Now with this, we don't have much time left, only about 5 minutes. He has the interviews scheduled, and he has to give a couple of internal talks. So are there any short questions and comments? Yes, Mr. Kim. Yes.
Thank you very much. Just short question. I understand that Donald Trump's policy objections is basically has two kind of facts. First, change in Washington, as he explains. The next is disregard the current international order, such as the relationship with China, with Russia, the relationship with European Union, with NATO, or all those kind of disregard on the international order. We have a serious concerns. I have one question. As you explains, he has committed to levy a kind of border tax to all kind of imports into the United States as high as 35 or 40%. But to my understanding, it is technically almost impossible because USA is a member country of WTO, and all member countries of WTO has proposed a kind of concessionary tariff rate. Probably in the case of US is very, very low. And you have the actual tariff rate. So you can adjust your tariff rate between actual rate and concessional rate. But currently, the U.S. concessional rate is much lower than 35%. So it's almost technically impossible. So I'd like to ask you, how can Donald Trump handle this issue? Will the U.S., in the extreme case, exit from WTO? That's my question.
Okay.
Yeah, my answer is take nothing for granted. Is the mic working? Take nothing for granted. And exit from the WTO and violating the agreement is perfectly within the realm of possibility with this man. This man will do anything. He'll do anything. So far, that's what we've seen. And so, as a matter of thinking about it, I wouldn't rule that out. I think it's more likely not to happen because the weight of opinion and charging everybody who exports to the United States that kind of tax is so disruptive that somewhere, somehow, somebody will tell them that. And the strategy, if it's more focused on certain countries, this makes very little sense. And the latest comment on that was he thought it was too complicated, and every time he hears about it, it's too complicated. He's more likely to throw it out because it's too complicated and he doesn't understand it than he is to worry about membership in an international organization. That's as he presents himself to me and the evidence at this point. I'm reacting to what I'm observing so far. And I'm saying to you, anything is possible with this new president. The people around him, there's the Secretary of Treasury would not agree with the border tax, neither would I think Wilbur Ross. Economists won't, but he's not going to pay attention to economists. And so be worried. You should be worried, but my guess is it doesn't happen.
Okay. The last one, we have to let him go. Is there any question? Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah. But Dr. Young?
Yeah, go ahead. We're going to go a few more minutes.
Yes.
Yeah.
4% growth by let's say 2019.
Yeah.
Now that assumes that the potential growth rate of the U.S. economy has been, ramped up.
It would go up some. The question is about
deregulation is one of the aspects of the Trump economics. You have not kind of touched upon it. I was wondering whether. 3
to 4% growth in 2019 is our forecast. That means a lot of demand growth, and then the question is what happens to the supply side of the economy.
Yes.
So that kind of demand means we'll have some capital spending, so the capital stock will go up, the labor force will go up. Maybe not productivity, but both of those tend to raise potential growth. And then your point about deregulation. Deregulation is in, regulation is out. The banks will be able to do more risk financing, which normally involves more entrepreneurial activity, which can help potential output. We're estimating potential output growth in the United States at 1.5 right now. It could go to 2, 2.25. But against 3 to 4%, given where we are now, that means a lot more inflation. A lot more inflation. We could be surprised on the upside on inflation.
Yes.
Let me
interest rate.
Yeah.
That's the problem there.
Yes, it means higher interest rates.
Yeah.
It's a bear market in fixed income in the U.S. We have been loud and clear on that.
Yes.
Long-term interest rates in 3 to 4 years, 10-year yield could be as high as 5%. This is an inflationary political event. The program is inflationary. It's deficit financed. We are already close to full employment in the labor market. That almost guarantees that nominal wages will go up and unit labor costs will go up. Companies will try to price to maintain margins. If demand is strong enough, thanks to the tax cuts and government spending, they'll get price increases. And the blind side surprise and real harm long run could be too much inflation. Then the question is, will the Fed be there as an independent central bank to stop it? The president has 6 appointments, or directly and indirectly, in the next year or so. The 2% price stable view of our Federal Reserve doesn't have to be that 2 years from now. They could change that. It could be gone, despite the fact that almost every central bank in the world has a 2% target. It can go just as it came. Not just in the U.S., it can go in other countries as well, including Japan. 2, 3, 4 years from now, I think those Japanese interest rates are going to be a lot higher than they are now. Not over the next year, because they're targeting 0. Yeah, this is higher interest rates. The next question is, how can the stock market do well? It always does well. If what drives the interest rates higher in the initial stages of rises of interest rates is better earnings. Better earnings come from better sales of volume and better, firmer prices. It's when the inflation gets so high that central banks say, we've got to stop it, the availability of funds is shut off, and the private sector gets overextended in debt and other reasons. That's when we begin to see the beginning of the stages to the next recession. What happens? Maybe we inflate away the debt. What happens when interest rates go up, if they do, to 5%, the long bond? Think of the interest on debt in the United States. It won't be like Italy, but we could then have, but this is years out, a sovereign debt problem. The bond market will be early on stuff like this. U.S. bond market will be early. And worry about stuff like this. Remember, he's not even in office. We haven't seen the details of the plan. I'm describing in a long time, but nanoseconds, relative to real time, a process. And markets do advance price, and we had some of that already. But as events unfold, if the reality happens on some hypothesis, then markets will price that. U.S. interest rates are going to go up, and a lot, to put it bluntly. A couple more quick ones.
Yeah. Any?
Yes.
저 한국말로 하겠습니다.
Okay. Speaking Korean.
2017년, 18년, 19년 미국 경제 좋게 보셨는데요. 경제가 성장하고 주가도 뭐 좋을 것이다 이렇게 예상하셨는데 혹시 근데 이제 미국 경제를 보면 미국 주가를 보면 2008년도, 2009년도 이후부터 지금까지 거의 한 8년 정도가 지속적으로 상승을 했습니다. 그래서 혹시 그 박사님께서 보시기에 2008년도 같은 그런 위험한 요인은 미국 경제라든지 세계 경제에 그런 요인이 있는지 아니면 언제쯤 그렇게 발생할 거라고 보시는지 궁금합니다.
Yes. No, not the 2008 situation. No. The financial excesses that took years to build up and that contributed to the Great Recession and the great financial crises of the U.S. and the world, I don't think are present now. We have some years to go before they will be. And that comment involves an awful lot of looking inside the U.S. economy, sector by sector, and where we are in terms of financial conditions. No. On the other hand, our thought, we think the U.S. stock market and other stock markets, not necessarily today, not necessarily tomorrow, will keep making repeated new highs, including the South Korean stock market, because of the macro wave, which will raise business earnings against the restraint of higher interest rates. Because interest rates will go up first in the United States, then in other countries later, but they will go up. No, the conditions are not in place for anything like 2008 happening. What is worrisome is outside the U.S. economic business cycle. What's worrisome is the accident of politics in the U.S., What is worrisome is the international geopolitical landscape and things that can happen, violent things that can happen. That's what's worrisome to me, is the uncertainty around how the president and the administration will relate to the rest of the world diplomatically, and whether we will have collisions and clashes as a result of a very clumsy approach to international diplomacy. The diplomats of the world don't operate the way Donald Trump does. Are they going to be able to work with him? We don't know. I worry about that because history is filled with accidents, wars, conflicts, and those do affect economies and markets. So the part I've picked that is positive and is optimistic is the macro policy part. We have experience with that. It's a smaller form of Reaganomics in the 80s. We had 5 years of boom. It's a bigger stimulus than during Kennedy Johnson. We had a big boom from the tax cuts. Democrats, we had 3 years of strong growth, 2006, 2003, tax cuts. Obamanomics, mostly government spending, transfer payments, didn't really work. Then we went to fiscal restraint. There's a lot of history that the tax reductions are very powerful. And of course, government spending, if it's real, and they actually spend the money, is going to raise GDP in any country that does it for at least a while. And these programs are meant to be more than just a year. So the growth is, I think, higher growth is pretty high odds if it all gets passed. But the world of international geopolitics and politics is hugely uncertain.
Another thing, since you focused macroeconomic the impacts of Trumponomics, but you didn't say much on the distributional aspect of Trumponomics. The irony is that he's all quite regressive tax cuts and the some of the spending program as well may have again worsened, not improve the distributional aspect, and therefore that may disappoint those people who supported him, particularly low-educated, low-wage, blue-collar workers. That may have some very societal, as you said, political repercussions in a few years to come. How that will work out in the political process of Trump administration?
If nominal wages are rising, and we have an unemployment rate of 3.5% to 4%, those workers will not notice inequality as much because they will feel they're better off. But the inequality will get worse because there's nothing in these plans specifically to reduce inequality. And eventually, I am pessimistic on rich versus poor and very concerned about the future of a country where relative inequality continues to get worse. But in the short run, 2 or 3 years, the next election 4 years from now, if that person who called in on that talk show that I talked about, wages are higher, and if that gentleman who complained about his kids not having a job after spending $100,000 in education, kids have a job and seem pretty happy, he'll be happy, those votes will stay with Mr. Trump or somebody like him. And the relative inequality will continue and go on, and someday come back to haunt the United States again. You see, my mind runs on several tracks. I run on the short term, the medium term, and the longer run. And the longer run sweep of history, my view has been for years, still is, and I could argue that his election supports this view, that the U.S., relative to the world on a 10, 15, 20-year horizon, is in relative decline. And we show all kinds of signs and symptoms of that and the election of a celebrity salesperson who caters to people who are really feeling badly and expresses himself the way he does is really a bad sign. And the program, which is going to create more debt, if we get a lot more inflation, and I just told you, but the central bank may not be an independent central bank. They may allow 3% inflation. If I'm a politician, I want to get reelected, people feel good. That's how I play the game. That's the way politicians in countries all over the world have played the game. That's why we have independent central banks, to stop that. And so I think, now, who is ascendant in the world? I continue to believe it's China and the Asian world. It certainly isn't Europe. It isn't Europe. The UK has a shot now that it has left the EU. This may sound unconventional. Am I a globalist? In some ways, yes. But if I'm a Brit, I'm going to go alone because I'm not French. I'm different from the French. And I don't want those people, the Troika, to run my policy. They did a miserable job in Europe. Austerity was terrible. And so if I were a Brit, I would have voted to be out. And frankly, I think they did the right thing. All my friends say, what's the matter with you, Alan? It's going to destroy globalization. It's going to destroy the Eurozone. And I say, well, the Eurozone in theory should hold together. One interest rate, one currency exchange rate. Is globalization the way we designed it and the way it has evolved and we have intellectually talked about it the right way? Or is some tweaking of it and modifying of it in the course of history and events? Look at Italy. Is Italy better off being part of the Eurozone? And the Eurozone spends $260 billion to bail out Greece, and they still need to keep doing that. I don't understand it. It can't work when you have one exchange rate, one interest rate, and a country gets in debt and then has to swallow austerity. The politics won't take it. These kinds of mechanisms, to me, don't work. So there is, I do say, what's in, what's out. To be confrontational to Larry Summers, we should have come talk and tell him I said this. Secular stagnation is out. Growth is in. The U.S. media as we know it is out. Twitter is in. Regulation is out. Deregulation is in. Certainty, predictability is out. Unpredictability is in. Globalization is out. Nationalism for the United States is in. And here is a very interesting dynamic for the world as to how, having geared ourselves to a globalized, intertwined world, we're going to react to that. Well, so much of that is trade and trade relations. It's a big mistake not to do that. But some of the pacts and agglomerations of countries, the Trump comments about NATO, you know what? NATO hasn't really paid as much as it should. Let's face it. But NATO is incredibly important to the security of the world. What can you say? But, you know, the U.S. pays a big share of everything. And so it's not odd that somebody says some of those countries are getting away with murder. The UK doesn't want to pay the bill of the European Union. It's one of the reasons some of the people in Britain wanted to leave. You're paying a bill to a group of countries whose policies and regulations constrain you, and it's not so understandable that people voted to leave. We'll see what happens.
Okay, the last one. Yes, Mr. Ha.
Thanks to your very promising U.S. economy, then I feel very up this morning. I have two questions. One is, once the U.S. economy is going to prosper as you expected, then how high is the chance Donald Trump is going to be reelected 4 years later? Second one is, Korean economy is more relying on the Chinese economy nowadays than U.S. then over this confrontational period between the U.S. and China, then how do you think the Chinese economy is going to go on going forward?
Let me go to the Chinese economy. We monitor that very closely. We follow it very closely. The GDP growth has bottomed out. We think there's going to be a number soon. We think that's going to be 6.72 or 3 year over year. We're not going to be as low as 6.25. 6.5 is about the bottom. We're forecasting 7% next year in GDP growth year over year. Now that's a kind of phony number, but it does say that the Chinese economy is bottomed out and it's beginning to pick up a little bit. That's a big plus for South Korea because the downward momentum, in a dynamic sense, the downward growth path has really stopped. We went from 11, 12% on their measure of GDP down to about 6.5, and we seem to be lifting up. Trade issues with the U.S. In confrontation, I think the rest of the world will end up trading with China, China with the rest of the world, and the U.S. will fail if it tries to do China in on trade. We might try to do that. So I'm optimistic about the South Korean economy because the U.S. consumer is going to be strong, get a big tax cut, and the U.S. is a big part, directly and indirectly, of the export story for South Korea. I'm optimistic because interest rates are low, and the political instability here is going to fade. You've been through the worst of it. I worry about South Korea because of the uncertainty of North Korea, but there's solace because I think the U.S. will stand by South Korea. As to your markets in Asia, they're going to be as toughly competitive as ever, and I am impressed by the competitiveness and the production capabilities and technology of the South Korean economy. So we have a growth rate up 0.2 or 0.3 of a percentage point next year, four-year country as a forecast, and higher the year after. That's our view on Asia, and we're looking at the global region of Asia to lift, including Japan, to lift the global growth rate Japan is turning as well. Their economy, not doing well, is going to do better, and we are thinking they move out of deflation to low inflation. We think the quantitative easing is over there. They're not going to do any more. But there's a big fiscal stimulus in Japan. There's a big fiscal stimulus coming in the U.S. There's fiscal stimulus coming in Canada. There's some, much less austerity in Europe. There may be some fiscal stimulus coming there. That is going to lift growth. So I have to encourage people on growth and activity in business. Strongly encourage them. Be careful, but think optimistically. Well, you notice I tried to avoid that. We just discovered I have this kind of amazing record on forecasting economies and markets over a long period of time. I was uneasy. I thought he could win. I said that from the beginning because of the unhappiness. I didn't really, as a bottom line forecast, say he was going to win. But the minute it was clear on that election night that he was going to win, my comments to clients were buy stocks, buy the dollar, and sell bonds. That was a trade. Those are still the trends. And, it wouldn't surprise me if he got reelected. You ask a forecaster who's gotten lucky on a lot of forecasts, and it's irresistible to make a forecast. It's like a gambler. You want to lose. I don't really want to lose on a forecast. I don't sleep at night if the forecast is wrong. And it's almost irresistible. I think he's going to be around longer than people think. And the performance and results are going to surprise a lot of people on the positive side. But I will say with Winston Churchill, who was a great statesman and leader, and who had eloquence and grace, unlike our current president. I will say what he said. Changing one's mind often is a virtue. And I'm a forecaster. So I reserve the right to change that forecast on a moment's notice.
Okay, with this, with Alan's past track record, I think we can bet on him, and that means that we can go home with a little bit of optimism rather than pessimism. I think in the midst of all these changes and big changes and big effects all over the world, I just hope Korea manage current leadership crisis and political crisis soon enough, so that we can deal with this, all the changes. I think we can do so with your support. I think we'll do. Okay, with this we have to end, and we are so anxious to wait for next year. First, okay. Thank you very much, Alan. Okay, thank you. Please join.